Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is a wild episode today because I finally watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, a show that my friends and family have been trying to get me to watch for years, but I don't watch things. But I did it, and I'm here to talk about it, and I think it's going to be pretty sweet. But before we get into all of it, we have some people we need to thank. The Sages of the Lodge, who with their monthly donations keep this show a-rolling every single day. So, without further ado, a shout out to Alex Pamal, David Fries, Shane Thomas Driscoll, Chris Perkowski, Corey Barchat, Scott Castellano, Maria Palmieri, The Family, Nick Taborski, Charlotte Astry, Kevin McBride, Michael Fay, Richard Arnold, Dan Muller, and Andrew Clay. You guys are all awesome. Thank you for everything you do and for fueling the lodge. And without further ado, let's talk about this show. So here's what I want to do. I want to, for the first about 5 minutes, really just kind of focus and talk about the show as a whole. But then the real way I want to do this is I want to give you my 10 favorite characters and tell you why I love them. Obviously, spoilers are coming, and I just think this format's probably the best way to do it. So without further ado, I have to say, it took me a little while to watch this show because I went on a little bit of a break in the middle of book 2, but I did end up coming back to it. I could say that when I finished book 1 and book 2, I said to myself, oh, well, this is a really, really good kid show. However, when we got to book 3, I was like, oh, this is a really, really good show. I mean, not that book 1 and book 2 weren't fantastic as they were. They were hilarious. They introduced all the characters in such a just consistent and well fleshed out manner. But then we got to book 3 and everything hits the fan. Like, we take character development to a next level. They take the action to the next level. They take the comedy to the next level. It's like they just spent book 1 and 2 building us up until we got to book 3. And it was all just so fluent and so beautiful. And the ending, man. You know, everybody I talked to about the show or that tried to get me to watch the show, they all said the same thing. Oh man, that ending. Oh man, that ending. That's all I heard from people who were trying to get me to watch this show. And if I'm being honest, they did not overhype it enough. I mean, the fact that they wrapped Aang's entire arc around the decision of whether or not to kill the Fire Lord and how he was just desperately trying to find another way, and then you're convinced he's going to do it, and then just poof. Incredible. Taking a man's power away from him. The ultimate punishment. Not death, but taking his power and freedom away from him. A true villain's fate, if you ask me. But anyway, let's talk about my 10 favorite characters. Now, these are going to be in no specific order. This is just going to be general, off the cuff. These are my 10 favorite characters, and this is why I love them. So, let's start with the big man himself, Aang. I think Aang was such a brilliant protagonist because he's a character they didn't try to do too much with. You know, they wanted him to be the good Boy Scout. Like, obviously, Aang is the character whose conscience is usually walking down the right path, you know. But I like that they took risks with him. I like that, you know, despite him usually having a good conscience and a good moral compass, I like the fact that he was really insecure. I really liked those things. I like that even though technically this guy's over 100 years old, he is still a kid, and he still did have a lot of growing up to do and had to grip with a lot of his insecurities. I thought it was fantastic. I think it was done very tastefully. It makes Aang such an easy character to root for. Like, it's so easy for the Boy Scout character to become annoying. It's so easy for the Boy Scout character to just not resonate with the audience, you know? Because not all of us have as good of a moral compass as, say, Aang does. But through him just being so vulnerable and being so insecure and needing to grow up, it made him very, very much relatable. And again, easy to root for. He's got the wise jester sort of vibes, you know? I absolutely loved the episode where he's losing his mind and he can't sleep. Because I think it truly is watching him spiral into madness, which is a serious thing, but they took such a funny spin on it. Um, I'll never forget when Momo and Appa, he's hallucinating them having an argument. That was probably one of, if not the funniest moment for me in the show. I'll get to what I think was the funniest moment, but that's later for some other characters. We'll get there. But anyway, I thought everything with Aang was handled so well. You know, everything from of course his friend was Boomy, right? Boomy's just as goofy and has those wise jester vibes as well. It makes me think that had Aang not been frozen and got to grow up in his time, he probably would have ended up a lot like Boomy. But Boomy was another great character. He's not going to be in this top 10, but let's just take this moment to give Boomy the honorable mention that he deserves. Moving on, let's get to Katara. I mean, Katara is a character dynamic we see pretty often. Like every group of adventurers and wanderers has their mom, the quote-unquote, the group mom. But I like the idea that Katara's character didn't stop there and that like her triumph wasn't a matter of compassion. I mean, it was in a certain way, but, you know, her arc was very revenge-focused. And I thought that was so peculiar for a character like Katara, who they easily could have just made her the moral compass character. And they didn't rest on that, especially in book 3. I think the thing I liked the most about her character was that she wasn't so quick to trust Zuko. Because don't get me wrong, I see how someone like Aang or Saka could easily allow that guy to just come into their group or believe he's on their side. I absolutely loved that Katara was the one who didn't quite trust this guy. And the best part is, like, she's a waterbender, but in those moments where she's talking to Zuko, like, she's the firebender in that room, if you know what I'm talking about. You can see the fire in her eyes when she's talking to him and is like, if you betray us, you make one false move, and I'll end you. Those aren't the exact lines, but it's basically what she said to him when Zuko, quote-unquote, switched sides. It didn't feel forced, and that's why I think when we get to our conclusion and Zuko and Katara are getting along and they fight side by side, it doesn't feel forced. It feels very real, because Katara wasn't just this compassionate, welcoming, forgiving, oh, give him a chance, he could prove himself. No. Katara was the stern one. Katara was the one who wasn't very forgiving. She's forgiving towards her friends, but not towards her enemies. So seeing the transformation for Zuko to Katara's friend instead of the enemy, I think it made both of their characters so incredibly compelling. Katara was another fantastic character. At times, she carried entire episodes. The bloodbending episode, man, like, Jesus. And her little misadventure with Zuko when she's on her little revenge quest. That's one of my favorite episodes in the show. It's just brilliant. And I didn't bring this up before, but the romance between Aang and Katara was something I thought was handled very well too. Not something that felt forced. I like that even though you could kind of get those vibes, Katara was always very resistant just because they were in the war. Again, it makes it believable, you know? But that'll be it for Katara. Moving on to Saka, the non-bender. I can't say enough good things about this character, because I feel like it's not often that our jester is also our leader. And I think that's the thing I love the most about Saka, was like he was always striving to be a good leader. And I think that's so profound, because living in this world where everybody's bending different elements and, you know, people have these crazy powers, Saka was never envious of any of that. He just wanted to be like his dad, you know? He just wanted to be a good leader for the crowd. He wanted to be a good swordsman. Like, he knew who he was. He knew he was a silly, like, son of a bitch. You know, he had no illusions about who he was. And I think that's what I love the most about Saka, is that he didn't really have a lot of illusions about who he was. He had moments where he needed to find himself and he needed to contest with the things he was conflicted about. But at the end of the day, I think what made Saka so lovable was that he always knew who he was. And I'll get into it more when I get up to her character. But speaking of the character romances, the Saka and Suki romance is absolutely on the nose amazing. But before I move on from Saka, I think the funniest line in the show comes from an exchange between him and Zuko, where he just straight up says, well, my first girlfriend turned into the moon. And Zuko responds, that's rough, buddy. Like, the show's comedy is very over the top most of the time, but the beauty of that was how contained and restrained and calm the joke delivery was. It's, again, fantastic. But now let's move on to Toph, who, in my opinion, even though, Aang tries to be funny a lot and Sokka, prided himself on being the jester of the squad, Toph was the funniest one, man. The okay, you can let me drown now when she thought it was Sokka rescuing her. I mean, the countless moments when they go to the play and they see all the different interpretations of their character, and Toph is the only one just overwhelmingly satisfied with who's playing her, despite the fact it might be the most inaccurate representation. It's so perfect. I love that, as the Earthbender, right? You think Earthbender, she's heavy-footed, she was the most stable of the group. And I like that a lot because I feel like that could be seen as an Earthbender quality. Despite her shortcomings, despite her, relatively tragic backstory, Toph is pretty mentally steady. She grips well with the challenges that are set before her. And I think that makes her such a cool character to watch. And if I'm being honest, I don't have many complaints about the show. Anything I complain about is admittedly a nitpick, but if there's one thing I could really, really nitpick them on, I wish they developed Toph's character more. I went into this a little bit with the previous characters, but whether it was Aang, Katara, or Sokka, they all got to have their misadventures with Toph, where we learn more about their character and they develop and we see them confronted with certain things. Toph never really got that moment. And this is one of the reasons I love the show, by the way. They kind of make fun of that later in book 3, that Toph never got that episode. So just that level of self-awareness is good enough for me, is what makes this a nitpick. But I think Toph was a brilliant character. I just love everything about her. She's fun to watch. She's hilarious. And I think the character design is cool. Okay. Now we got to talk about the big man. Now, I don't know who my favorite characters in the series are, but if there's a top 3, these next 2 characters are in it. And the first one is Iroh. Uncle Iroh is fucking amazing. He's the wise... The show doesn't overdo it when it comes to wise mentors, because Uncle Iroh fits the bill and fills that void completely, that we don't need to get it from anywhere else. And I love the idea that they took a character like Iroh and they wanted to make him the wise man, right? They wanted to make him Zuko's moral compass. But that wasn't just because he's the old wise man. And that wasn't just because, he came from experience. He was always a gentle soul. No, Iroh's backstory, to me, is, probably the best written thing in the show. The fact that he's a former war chief, guilty of war crimes, Fire Nation slaughter. He was a pawn in that game, and he allowed those travesties to happen. But it wasn't until the malevolence of the world came to his front door that he changed his way. It was only when his son was taken from him that he realized he was walking the wrong path. And I think there's a level of truth to that. If anyone's doing wrong, if we have shortcomings in our life, or if we have things that we're not doing correctly, we don't really contend with those things until they hit home, until they've hurt ourselves or until they've hurt somebody that we love. And I think the song's called "Leaves from the Vine," but that episode where he's kind of playing it around town, and then you find out it's about his son. Man, if that doesn't choke you up, you're a straight sociopath. That's all I have to say about that. It so brilliantly delivered because they kept that from you. They kept that detail about Uncle Iroh from you for the longest time. Again, I commend him. I think it was incredible. I like that he plays the long game. And I like that even though he couldn't bring his son back, there was no righting that wrong. No matter what, his son was gone forever. So there was no bringing his son back. But I like that in his mind, redeeming his son and redeeming himself was about saving Zuko. And I think that brings us into our next character, Zuko, who I want to talk about. But one last thing that just popped into my head. The scene where he's pretending to be like this pathetic prisoner and eat scraps and just be like a hungry dog. But then when the guard leaves and this motherfucker is doing these pull-ups and he's jacked. Man, I jumped out of my seat in absolute hype. I was in the middle of eating dinner and I jump out of my freaking seat. Like, let's go, Iroh. Let's get it. So now let's talk about Zuko, who, if I had to pick a favorite character, it would probably be Zuko. Just because of the intensity, right? Like every character in the show has their arc and deals with their challenges and has to overcome something in their past or has to overcome a flaw. Like everyone's following that same pattern. But Zuko's following it with a level of intensity that is unmatched by the rest of the cast. And I like that because he's our firebender, right? He ends up being our crew's firebender. And I like that because fire is intense, right? You know, fire has a massive presence. Fire is bold and commands the stage when it takes the stage. So, I mean, everybody loves a good redemption arc, right? And only the Fire Nation can fix the Fire Nation. Change has to come within, even with the Avatar. Change has to come from within. And I like that Uncle Iroh's plan for Zuko the whole time was to just turn him into a philosopher king. You know, preach him these little lines of wisdom. And you see that Zuko is just, when the show starts, he's so resistant to anything Uncle Iroh says. But it's like, repetition is the hammer of knowledge, right? As the show goes on and Iroh keeps just beating that wisdom into his brain, eventually it starts to tear his walls down. And like I was saying before, once Zuko saw that he let down Uncle Iroh, things started to change in his head a little bit. You know, in a weird way, not in a weird way, I shouldn't say that, but there was a part of me that kind of wanted Zuko to steal Katara from Aang, just because I thought Zuko and Katara had such good chemistry. But if I'm being honest, it wasn't in the cards. You know, that was meant from Aang for the beginning. But man, the way they left the show off, by the way, that Zuko's like, tell me about my mother. You're going to tell, like, whoo, baby. I love that too. I love that, like, a good character like Zuko, their story's never finished. Because an adventurer at heart is on to the next adventure, the next step, once the show ends. And I gotta say, him becoming Aang's firebending teacher, really something else. Really something else. Because the truth is, like, if change is going to happen in the world, if we're going to see changes, if things are going to get better, it's because guys like Zuko and Aang can come together. Two guys who are diametrically opposed, who come from different backgrounds, have different beliefs and perspectives, but they find common ground and come together. You know, it's like Aang was representing the outside world coming in to change the Fire Nation, and Zuko was kind of representing the Fire Nation that would change from within. And I just thought there was something really cool about that. But let's talk about our final Fire Nation character here, who's another intense beam, which is Azula, who is ruthless, man. And look, as I was saying about Saka before, what I love about Saka is Saka knows who he is. Saka knows exactly who he is. Azula's no different. Azula knows exactly who she is. And that's a thing. It's a tragedy. You know? It's such a tragedy. I think the show does a great job of subtly delivering that to you. That Azula is a walking, breathing tragedy. I mean, Zuko is too, but honestly, in my opinion, Azula even more so. I mean, you think about that fun episode, right? Where the Fire Nation, like, in a sense, they crash like a college frat party or something. You know, they're around a bunch of kids their age who are partying and, you know, socializing and getting to know each other. And some of the funniest moments of that episode was seeing how socially inept Azula was, her fake laugh. She couldn't connect with anyone. And all that was funny, right? But when you really step back, like, how sad is that? That, you know, she's so used to controlling everyone around her with fear. Like, everyone in her life, she controls with fear. And then to just be thrust into this new environment and her not even know how to handle herself. Like, she doesn't even know how to laugh at a joke. That's sad. That means she doesn't know what joy feels like. She never expressed true joy. I mean, when do you see her ever genuinely laugh when it's not like that hearty villain laugh or when it's coming from malevolence? When does it come from joy? You know, you don't see that from Azula. But with that said, her ruthlessness was so compelling. Because I think diversity in a cast is important. And this is where bad guys are so, and villains are so compelling to us. Is because, you know, the good guys have to stay within a box. For the most part. They're allowed to do wrongdoings. They're allowed to commit evil acts or malevolence. But they have to stay in a box. Villains like Azula, there's no box. They put you in the box. There's no box for Azula. And that's a fault, mind you, because that's what leads her to slip. Seeing her slowly slip at the end when she got everything she wanted. She was always after power. That's all she cared about was power. And then she becomes the Fire Lord. She got everything she wanted. And she slips into absolute madness. And man, it was cool to watch. I have to say, you feel bad for her to an extent, because honestly, you know, that world's better off with Azula behind bars. But man, her defeat was poetic too. You know, she challenged Zuko to the Agni Kai, and Zuko was just too good. You know, he wasn't necessarily winning the fight, but he wasn't losing. And that was enough to get Azula nervous. So of course she goes for the cheap shot and tries to take out Katara. Zuko, a changed man, saves her, sacrifices himself. He doesn't die, obviously, but kind of gives up his body to save Katara. And how does Katara beat Azula? Bounds her in chains. Azula, who was only ever after power and control, and was controlling people with fear, she ends up bound in chains. And man, seeing her just like scream and the fire coming out of her mouth, she turned into a wild animal. It's like she almost ceased to be a human. Like, of course, she's still a human and has feelings, but in that moment, because she was bound in chains and had no control and had she lost herself completely. And I like that the show did not pull any punches with her breakdown. All right, now let's talk about Suki. Suki to me is just such a pleasant surprise of a character. You don't know how big a role she's going to have when you first meet her. Hell, you don't have a clue how big a role she's going to have the second time she comes back around. But she ends up making herself into a vital player among our crew. And I couldn't have been happier. I think her and Saka, by the way, make a perfect couple. I mean, they're both non-benders, but they're both leaders. You know what I'm saying? They both kind of share that. And where Suki is more of like a serious leader, like where she's leading the Kyoshi Warriors, Sokka's more of a goofy leader. So it's like they're the same, but they're different. And like, you just can't write shit better than that. So gotta give it up to him. Also, the face paint was cool. I like the design. Thought it was awesome. And she's crafty as hell. That's one of the things that's cool about the character tool, which reminds me of Sokka again, is that she's incredibly crafty. You know, in many ways, more crafty than Saka. But yeah, Suki's great. I'm glad they found a way to include her long term. Just a great character through and through. Loved it whenever she was on screen. Thought her and Saka had a great dynamic because, you know, she cringes at Saka like we all do, but she adores it. And I think there's something cute about that. But anyway, I want to talk about Saka and Katara's dad. Because to me, when you think about the parallel between him and Azula and Zuko's dad, the Fire Lord, think about, just line those two pairs up, right? Think about Saka, Katara, and their dad, and think about Azula, Zuko, and their dad. And you might be noticing a difference about why one set of characters' moral compass might be better than the other. You might notice how big a role both those fathers are playing in their children's life and development. I mean, the parallel of like that wise, like guiding hand of a father, and then the parallel of that to the just tyrannical, controlling father. It shows you why those two sets of characters ended up the way that they did. And, as a role model for Sokka, it makes perfect sense, because that's the reason Sokka never cared about not being able to bend, That's the reason Sokka only ever cared about being a good leader, is because he wanted to be like his dad, And I think there's something cool about that. I do. He always has a fatherly presence when he's on the screen. And their rescue of him was also one of my favorite points in the whole show. But last but not least, although in some ways maybe least, let's talk about the Fire Lord. Now, he's a great villain, but here comes one of my nitpicks. He needed more screen time, I like the development they gave him when this is just before the final fight and they find a picture of him. They find like a picture of him as a baby. And I really like that because it forces you to look at the monster before he was a monster. It forces you to look at the monster when it was still innocent, cute. And I think that's the point that's being delivered here, is even an absolute monster like the Fire Lord at one point was this clean slate, was just a cute baby, just trying to be loved. I love that. But I would have preferred if that same idea was fleshed out with an episode or two of backstory. There are degrees of it, but I feel like the Fire Lord never got the attention he deserved. I was never really afraid of him. I was afraid for Aang, and was afraid for Aang failing, but I was never quite afraid of the Fire Lord. And I think there was room to work with that. But enough of that. The thing I love about the character is that he never felt forced. Nothing about him felt forced or really over the top. He was always acting within character, never really broke or did anything that would be considered unorthodox for him. But I do want to say I love the symbolism at the end about his desire to be the phoenix that rises from the flames. Like, I think he wants to be like the Phoenix King, and he has like this whole new phoenix get up, and the whole idea is he's like going to burn the world down, and him and his world will be what rises from the flames. And the reason I love that is because, nah, bitch, Aang is the phoenix here. Aang is the phoenix that will rise from the ashes. Because Aang failed. That's the thing. Where the Fire Lord hasn't failed, where he's just had success this whole time, Aang failed. He failed 100 years ago, and we watched him fail in every goddamn book. But he came through at the end. He rose and was the phoenix that rose from the flames, not the Fire Lord. And again, it doesn't get much better than that, guys. It really doesn't. It's a great show. Again, I want to reiterate what I said in the beginning. When I watched book 1 and book 2, I was like, man, this is an amazing kid show. But when I was in the middle of book 3, I was like, man, this is an amazing show. I mean, the only other complaint I would have is I wish it was longer. I wish there was a book 4. I wish we fleshed this out. I wish it was double the episodes, man. Because everything they did was nearly a home run. Some episodes were a little fillerish, and some episodes weren't as satisfying as others. But if you take Avatar: The Last Airbender as a whole, it is a home run, baby. It is a slam dunk. And honestly, I loved every minute of me watching. And if you've watched every minute of this podcast or listened to it, well, then I love you. Because we're at the end here. I don't have much more to say. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a terrific show. Let me know what you think about it. Feel free to drop in the YouTube comments. Feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram or Twitter. I love the show. I would love to talk about it. But without further ado, I can't thank all of you enough for listening and engaging in my content. I love doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. And can't thank you all enough for your support. But without further ado, take care, everybody, and we will see you on the next one.